indefinitely slow walking all of this? How can half the Senate not rise to the occasion at a time when everybody else in the country is pulling together? They're pulling us apart. The examples are all over the country that we ought to look to. Healthcare heroes, to neighborhood volunteers, to national industries. Everybody is unifying and pitching in. What about here in the Senate? It's time to get with the program. It's time to pass historic relief that we have built together. The country doesn't have time for these political games. They need progress. So we're going to vote in just a few minutes. And I assure you, Mr. President, the American people will be watching.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Majority Leader. Is there objection? With the Assistant Democratic Leader objects. Objection is heard. The Democratic Leader. The Democratic Leader. The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, every time we hear the Majority Leader come out, it's a partisan screed. Well, I'm in my office with the President, Secretary of Treasury, the President's Congressional Liaison, getting things done. We Democrats are trying to get things done, not making partisan speech after partisan speech. Now, in the past 24 hours, we got word that a member of this chamber, Senator Paul, has tested positive for coronavirus. And the husband of another member, Senator Cloture, also tested positive. He's in the hospital. I want to let them know, both of them, that the Senate's thinking of them, praying for their speedy recovery, as we are for tens of thousands of American families who are confronting the same situation right now. Whether you're afraid for a sick family member, an older relative in the hospital, or are struggling without work, income, or the knowledge of when your isolation might end, our thoughts are with you right now. These are trying times for all of us, but the scourge of this disease will pass. The American people, as always, will prevail. As the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in the United States eclipses 35,000, the Senate continues to negotiate what will likely be the largest emergency funding bill in American history. As I've mentioned, we've had almost continuous discussions with Secretary Mnuchin. He left my office at about 12:15 last night and was there at about 9 this morning. The White House Congressional Liaison, Eric Uland, has been in and out of the office as well. We're very close to reaching a deal, very close. And our goal is to reach a deal today. And we're hopeful, even confident, that we will meet that goal. We've been working on a few outstanding issues that are no surprise to everyone. From the very beginning, Democrats have insisted on a Marshall Plan for our medical system. More money for hospitals, community health centers, nursing homes, and urgent medical supplies like gloves and masks, ICU beds, testing kits, ventilators, and PPE. Since our negotiations, the numbers have gone up dramatically because the hospitals Our healthcare workers need the help. We're fighting hard and making progress for funding for state and local governments. They're propping up local healthcare networks virtually on their own. Their revenues are dramatically declining. Many towns and villages across America, the smaller ones in particular, might be going broke pretty soon if we do nothing. If we can help the big corporations, we can help our local towns and villages and the taxpayers they represent. On unemployment insurance, the bill has moved in the direction we've outlined. The original bill had the unexpanded employment benefits last only 3 months. We need to make it longer because the dislocation caused by this crisis will not be over in 90 days, and people who lose their jobs need help. But it says to every American who loses his or her job, the Democratic plan that is now in the bill, that you will get your full pay from the federal government. You can be furloughed by your employer. That means you'll keep your benefits, health and otherwise. And it means that you'll be able to come back and the business you had to leave can reassemble itself quickly after, God willing, this crisis ends. The bill still includes something that most Americans don't want to see: large corporate bailouts with almost no strings attached. Maybe the majority leader thinks it's unfair to ask protections for workers and labor to companies that are getting hundreds of billions of dollars. We think it's very fair to ask for those. Those are not extraneous issues. That is a wish list for workers, nobody else. And so we are looking for protection. We're looking for oversight. If this federal government's making a big loan to someone, to a big company, we ought to know it and know the details immediately. The bill that was put on the floor by the Republican leader said no one would know a thing about those loans for 6 months at least. And in those so-called bailouts, we need to protect workers, the workers those industries employ. We've been guided by one plan: workers first. That's the name of our proposal. The bill needs to reflect that priority. Now, we're working on all these items in good faith as we speak, and we hope and expect to conclude negotiations today. This vote in the Senate, it's no surprise. It's to take a merely repeat of the vote that failed last night. Leader McConnell continues to set arbitrary vote deadlines when the matter of real importance is the status of the bipartisan negotiations. So let me be clear. The upcoming procedural votes are essentially irrelevant. The negotiations continue no more than 30 feet away from the floor of the Senate in our offices, where the real progress is taking place. Once we have an agreement that everyone can get behind, we're prepared to speed up the consideration of that agreement on the floor. So I'm going to get back to negotiations. We all know time is of the essence. The country is facing the twin crises in our healthcare system and in our economy. We have an obligation to get the details right, get them done quickly. That doesn't mean blindly accepting a Republican-only bill. That was the bill we were given. Lots of things we didn't even know about Saturday. That means working to make this bill better for our small businesses, better for our working families, better for our health care system. Democrats will not stop working with our Republican counterparts until we get the job done. I'll continue to update the Senate on the progress of our negotiations. And I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the quorum be dispensed with.
Is there objection?
Thank you, Mr. President.
I object.
The Democratic leader
This
objection
is
is heard.
unbelievable.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the senator from Maine be allowed to speak for a few minutes.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Is there objection? The Democratic leader, objection is heard. Is there objection? The Democratic leader, objection is heard. The senator from Louisiana. Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President,
The Democratic leader, objection is heard.
I would simply like to know, for the sake of the members,
The Senate is in a
unanimous
quorum call.
consent to speak for 30 seconds.
Is there objection?
And I would simply...
The Senate is in a quorum call. Is there objection to removing the quorum call?
Mr. President,
Is there objection to removing the quorum call?
reserving the right to object.
There is no right to reserve the right to an object.
I have the floor. I would ask...
No, you do not. The Senate is in a quorum call. You ask that the
I
quorum
ask
call
unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Is there objection?
I would simply like to ask the leader, before we have these speeches, because we were supposed to vote for the next time after he and I spoke, what is the schedule for the rest of the day? Would he respond to
the majority leader?
Mr. President, it's my understanding they're going to let us voice vote this.
We have no objection to voice voting the first two, and then would like to vote, if the leader wants, now on the third, and then we can have the speeches.
So what you're proposing is that we voice vote
Majority
the
leader.
next two, and then the cloture vote occurs automatically?
That is correct.
Parliamentary inquiry. Does the cloture vote occur now?
Yes, the cloture vote pops and occurs third automatically.
All right, I propose that we voice vote the first two and then pause so that there are some speeches allowed by members up to an hour, those speeches allowed by members before the cloture vote.
So I have no objection
the
to that.
Democratic leader.
As long as we have a schedule, I have no objection to that.
The understanding of the chair is that there will be voice votes on the first two motions, and then there will be an hour of debate equally divided. There will be an hour of debate prior to a vote on the cloture motion upon reconsideration. Majority leader?
Yeah. It's fine.
The hour would be, the understanding of the chair is that the request is that the hour of debate would be equally divided prior to the cloture vote on the motion to proceed.
Mr. President,
The majority leader?
I move to proceed to the motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the motion to proceed to H.R. 748.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to reconsider the vote by which the cloture was not invoked on the motion to proceed to H.R. 748.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. There is now an hour of debate equally divided under the previous order. The majority leader.
It would be 30 minutes in length.
Is there objection? Without objection, the vote will be 30 minutes in length. So ordered.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maine.
Mr. President, we are in the midst of a crisis in our country, a crisis caused by the coronavirus. I cannot believe that the answer to this crisis, as we move to address the economic consequences that are so severe for the people of this country, that the answer from our friends on the other side of the aisle is delay, delay, delay. no sense of urgency, no hurry. I will tell you, Mr. President, I've had the honor to serve in this body for many years. Never, never have I seen Republicans and Democrats fail to come together when confronted with a crisis. We did so after 9/11. We did so with the financial meltdown in 2008. Here we are facing an enemy that is invisible, but equally devastating to the health of our people and to the health of our economy. And yet, unbelievably, the Democratic leader objected to my even being able to speak this morning. Is that what we've come to? The Democratic leader objected to our convening at 9 o'clock this morning so that we could begin working in earnest. Is that what we've come to? The fact is we have been working on a bipartisan effort through task force with both Republicans and Democrats, making very good progress and putting together a comprehensive package, the third package that we have dealt with. This one is to address and prevent the economic devastation that is being caused by this virus. We don't have another day. We don't have another hour. We don't have another minute to delay acting. I have talked with businesses all over my state, small mom and pop businesses like a diner, a third-generation diner operated by the Simonis family in Lewiston, Maine. For the first time ever, they have had to close their doors. As Linda Simonis told me through tears yesterday, this is the first time ever we've been unemployed. Our son is unemployed. Our friends who have worked with us at this diner for years are unemployed. And we have a very good plan that we've worked in a bipartisan way. Marco Rubio and I on the Republican side, Ben Cardin and Jean Shaheen in very good faith on the Democratic side, that would help these small businesses and keep their employees paid, keep their employees getting paychecks. How can that possibly be controversial? How can any of us want to see millions of Americans lose their paychecks, their health insurance, their contributions to their retirement plans? We have a package that's part of this broader legislation. As the majority leader pointed out just yesterday, had we invoked cloture, that's not the end of the process. There still could have been 30 hours for us to refine this package. And keep in mind, every single one of these task forces have been bipartisan. Do we agree on everything? Of course not. But surely, in this time of extreme crisis for our country, when people are getting sick, when people are dying from the coronavirus, when we are facing unemployment rates which could go as high as 20%, according to the Treasury Secretary, surely we ought to be able to pull together and work quickly to respond to the needs of the American people. Mr. President, I cannot believe the objections to proceeding to this package. Is this package perfect? No, but that's why negotiations are still going on. But don't we want to act quickly to provide relief to the American workers? This is disgraceful. We do not have time. Time is not on our side. Let's get the job done for the American people.
Mr. President.
The senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise because my dear friend, I can tell, is very upset. And I'm upset. I'm upset that we're at this point. I really am. I'm working with you on so many things in a bipartisan way, and I always have, always will. But with that being said, let me make sure, I haven't been here as long as many of you have, the experience that you have. But the way I understand it, voting for cloture takes a 60-vote threshold, except for the judges, which basically the previous leader, Senator Reid from Nevada, changed. I was opposed to that. We're in a situation now to where if you vote yes on cloture and then you're not in agreement with the bill, then it only takes 51. That seems to be the reason that everyone's saying, wait a minute, let's get an agreement so we can move through. That's what I have always heard. That's the way I understand it. So they're afraid, basically, if you vote for cloture, even though it's not the things you're wanting or haven't been negotiated out, then you vote for a 51, even with the 30 hours of curing, and then it goes from there. Then we're back to where we have not had any negotiation because the majority has the control at 51. That's what I think the fear is here. The problem that we have in West Virginia right now, you can throw all the money at Wall Street you want to. You can continue to put trillions upon trillions. People are afraid to leave their home. They're afraid because they're afraid of the health care. I've got workers who don't have masks. I've got health care workers that don't have gowns. I've got hospitals that won't be open in another 60 days because they have no cash flow. And it looks like we're worried more about the economy than we are the health care and the well-being of the people of America. Yes, sir.
Majority Leader.
My question is, does the senator understand that even if cloture were invoked, there's still 30 more hours?
We know that, the 30 hours. I said
so
that.
In what way, I would ask my friend from West Virginia, would your side be disadvantaged by that? The American people are waiting for us to act today.
Yeah,
Senator from West Virginia.
She's laid it out very clearly, as she always does. We don't have time for this. We don't have time for it.
Let me ask you a question. On the 30 hours.
Answer my question. In what way would the Democratic minority be
because you, the majority, you have...
Senator from West Virginia. Senator from West Virginia has the floor.
Sir, no, anything I'm saying, 30 hours to 30 days, as long as you have the majority, 51 votes rule. So the final vote is going to be on passage, whether you have to negotiate or not with us.
The majority leader.
We'd have to, if my friend would yield, we'd have to get cloture again once we got on the bill. In other words, this is cloture on the motion to proceed to the bill. Let me explain it to my good friend from West
understand.
Virginia. Here's the way it works, colleagues. We have been fiddling around, as the senator from Maine pointed out,
Mr. President,
for 24 hours.
Senator from West Virginia has the floor.
Can I?
I'll be happy. I know where you're coming from on this. We just have a little different opinion about this.
I thank my friend from West Virginia. I think
the majority leader.
Colleagues would benefit from understanding where we are. We've been fiddling around for 2 days
if I could just make my...
on the motion to proceed.
Yeah.
If, my friend, if that were invoked, there's still 30 more hours post-closure on the motion to proceed. Once you get on the bill, you have to go through it again. So there's no way in which...
The senator from West Virginia.
We should be able to get a deal that we can move forward in unanimous consent. We really should. That's what I'm hoping for, and I think we can do it. Let me go back and say where I'm coming from. My whole thing is based around the health care right now. You can't throw enough money to fix this if you can't fix the health care. If you can't give my people in West Virginia and across this country the feeling that we have a treatment and we're moving towards a vaccine, they're not leaving their homes. My restaurants aren't going to open up. So the most important thing, how do we take care against the workers that have lost their jobs, no fault of their own? Businesses have closed, same in my state as your state, no fault of their own. That's the package we had to get out. We have $160 billion moving right now. Moving right now. So I'm saying this, it looks like things are weighted towards the Wall Street corporation side. True or false? We're not in the front line, not one of the big four. Many of us, 100 of us, are not there negotiating at the table. Our staffs are all having input. We're working on that, but sitting there making the final decisions. This comes down, can we give the confidence that we can rise to the occasion to keep the people healthy in our states? My hospitals need to stay open. My health care workers need to be healthy. They need to be protected. And it seems like we're talking about everything else about the economy versus the health care. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. The people who aren't getting a check right now, we can get a check to them. We should. But it seems like we're more focused on the big corporations and the health care of Wall Street than we are the health care of the people in rural America and Main Street. That's the problem that I've had on this, and that's the problem that we've been talking about. So we want to fix this. I'm not talking about all the regulations you're talking about. I don't know anything about that. I will find out if it's buried in the bill, and it's not what I would approve either right now. We don't need it. But if you're giving all the preferences to the large corporations that can shield and hide and do buybacks and everything else, don't you think the American worker ought to get something or be protected some way? I think that's really what it's like. And that's what we're talking about.
Mr.
Senator
President,
from Tennessee.
I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, as the majority leader said, all this vote is about is shall we get on the bill? Can we debate the issue? Can we together decide what to do about what is the most significant health care crisis in a century in this state? Can we get on the bill? We're saying yes, they're saying no. Now, as far as the distinguished senator from West Virginia says, what about the people who need help? I have a friend who emailed me last night, said it's too late. I'm closing 5 small businesses. These are little businesses. Well, why did we not vote last night on this? Because in that bill is the proposal by Senator Collins, Senator Cardin, Democrat, Senator Rubio, Republican, Senator Sheen, Democrat, that would loan to small businesses of less than 500 people money so they could pay their employees in West Virginia and Tennessee. And then if they did that, that would be forgiven. In other words, it's a grant. They could keep working. That's for the employees, Mr. President. That's for the employees. And every day we wait, they don't get paid. Pass this bill, and the laid-off employees would be available for sick leave, which they weren't when the bill came over from the House. Pass this bill today, and the employee that was laid off last week could be available for 2 weeks of sick leave at today's salary. Pass this bill, Mr. President, and most Americans would get $1,200 per person, $2,400 a couple, $500 more for a child. They would get it 1 day sooner if you'd passed this bill last night. These are not controversial proposals. On the Collins, Rubio, Cardin, Shaheen proposal, I happened to be watching Robert Reich, the former Labor Secretary for President Clinton, about as far to the left as anybody goes. Someone asked him, what would be the single best thing Congress could do to help workers get their money and be paid? He said exactly what the Collins, Rubio, Cardin, Shaheen proposal would do. Loan money to those with 500 and less and let them keep working. And as for this business about big corporations, Darden is a big corporation. It owns lots of restaurants. Gaylord's a big corporation. It owns Opryland. If it has a credit problem and the Federal Reserve Board can make sure that it has enough money to stay in business, all the people who work at the Grand Ole Opry can continue to have jobs. If they don't, they'll be out of work. Now, what's wrong with that? I mean, the goal of that, whether you work for a big company or a little company, you're still an American citizen, whether you work for FedEx or the local diner. And as far as solving the problem of the disease, and then I'll let others speak, pass this bill and 1 day sooner, we'd have $10 billion to accelerate treatments. Treatments are what we need to accelerate vaccines. Vaccines are what we eventually need. Pass this bill and we would have $75 billion for hospitals, $10 billion for those diagnostic treatments I just mentioned, $1.7 billion to buy more masks. All of that could happen 1 day sooner if the other side weren't trying to attach its political agenda to a crisis bill. This is no time to be running a political campaign. As the majority leader said, the House, dominated by Democrats, sent us their ideas. We passed it through without a single amendment, even though we didn't agree with many of their ideas. We worked for days with our counterparts on the Democratic side and have proposed a bill with their ideas, such as unemployment compensation, $600 per per person. That's twice as much as you get in unemployment compensation without this bill in Tennessee. So finally, I would say, Mr. President, pass this bill, and one day sooner, a Tennessee worker, instead of getting $326, would get nearly $1,000 if he or she has been laid off. There is no excuse for delaying getting on this bill, and it's outrageous that it will happen.
Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I think we all know what's happening here. The leader pointed it out in his opening remarks. Everything was going really quite well. There were a lot of working groups that were meeting. There was great bipartisan cooperation. Both sides were getting ideas included in a plan. And then yesterday, the Speaker of the House showed up with an agenda. And then all of a sudden, it got taken over at the leadership level. And so now, instead of talking about helping workers, we're talking about the Green New Deal and all kinds of other things that demands that the unions and other special interest groups want to see in this deal. But the throwaway line that this is about bailouts for big corporations, really? Are we going to do that again? Are we going to do this again? You guys are going to come over here and block votes and use the line that this is a bailout for big corporations? You heard it. You heard what Senator Alexander just said. This has money in here for workers. This has money for families. This has money for small businesses. Lots of the money. $300 billion is going to go to checks. $1,200 per person, $2,400 per couple, $500 per child for everybody, up to $75,000 for a single and $150,000 for a married couple filing jointly. $250 billion in here for unemployment insurance, as the senator from Tennessee pointed out, to plus up and top off those unemployment those unemployment funds that the states have. Add $600 per person per week for the next 3 months. That's going to help unemployed people in this country. The small business loan program that was just alluded to, that Senators Rubio and Collins and Cardin and Shaheen have worked on, is a $350 billion program that allows small businesses to pay their employees, to keep them employed, so they keep their jobs, so those jobs don't go away. That right there is $900 billion going to workers. Senator Alexander pointed out there's over $242 billion in this bill that's going out to help out with health care. And we all know we've got to help our hospitals. And between the $75 billion in direct spending in this particular provision and the $25 billion or more that's going to be part of the Medicare provisions, that's $100 billion for hospitals, $20 billion for veterans' health care, $11 billion for vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other preparedness needs, $4.5 billion for Centers for Disease Control, $1.7 billion for the strategic national stockpile, $12 billion for the military, $10 billion for block grants to states, $12 billion for K-12 education, $6 billion for higher education, $5 billion for FEMA Disaster Relief Fund, $10 billion for the airports, and $20 billion for the public transportation emergency relief. All told, $242 billion, $186 billion, I might add, which goes through the states. Everybody's talking about helping out the states. $186 billion of the $242 billion in this part of the bill goes out to the states. So there's there's another $250 billion. You're looking at 1.2, 1.3 trillion roughly of this bill that is going to healthcare workers, hospitals, medical providers, families, employees, and unemployed people. That's where it goes. Now, yes, there is $500 billion in here to keep industries afloat that are failing, and they are failing by the day and shedding jobs by the day. And these aren't grants, although the Democrats did want some grants in here, I might add. These are loans. These have to be paid back. And bailouts usually apply to somebody who did something dumb on their own, made a bad business decision. These companies aren't in trouble because of something they did on their own. This is no fault of their own. They're in trouble because they've been shut down. Shut down. And they all hire millions of employees in this country. So yes, we probably need to do something to help businesses in this country so they can keep working and keep their employees working. This was put together with a lot of bipartisan input. The leader appointed task forces. The Democrat leader assigned people as task forces. I observed those meetings, the discussions that went on. They were bipartisan. I participated in some of those. They were bipartisan. And we came together, and all these things that have been put together in this plan were developed with an idea toward getting help to workers, employees, small businesses, healthcare professionals, the people who are fighting the crisis on the front line. But here we are dilly-dallying around, can't even get on the bill. As the leader pointed out, there's another 60-volt threshold that comes later. If you want to block it then, you can block it then. We can't even get on the bill. The country is burning. The country is burning, and your side wants to play political games. It's time to get this done. The American people expect us to act. They need action. We need to work together to get this done for the American people. But don't come out here and say over and over and over again, this is bailouts for big corporations. This bill is about workers, it's about people, it's about families, it's about people who are hurting out there economically. And we need to do something about it, and we're in a position to do something about it, and it's high time that we did.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, I'd like to suggest to my friends on both sides of the aisle that we first assume the appropriate distance and then secondly take a deep breath. The emotions that we've seen on the floor on both sides of the aisle are reflected in homes across America, where families are very emotional at this moment as we face this public health crisis. It's no surprise that that is reflected on the floor of the Senate. But we're going to solve this problem, and we're going to do it in a timely way, which the American people expect of us. We've had two measures now that have come before us, one for $8 billion, another for $100 billion, which were addressed on a bipartisan basis with an agreement. This will be as well. Now, this argument that we can't spare 1 minute, we can't spare 1 day, I understand the sense of urgency. The House of Representatives passed the second bill, the $100 billion bill, in the early morning hours of Saturday. When did the Senate pass the bill? Wednesday, more than 4 days later. So a $100 billion bill, which included medical leave, accelerated access to unemployment compensation, food, new Medicaid payments to states, a guarantee that you'd never have to pay for a test. The Republican leader waited 4 days to call that bill. His argument was, wait a minute, the paperwork's not here. Well, I checked on that because the senator from Idaho raised it on the floor. And it turns out that many, many times, and we were prepared here, by consent you can move on a measure before the paper actually comes across.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, would the senator from Illinois yield to an inquiry?
I would.
Isn't it a fact that when you were up here talking, demanding that we pass that bill, the bill wasn't here? Now, I've been 40 years in Senate, state, and here. I've never been able to convince a parliamentarian that we should vote on a House bill that wasn't here. It wasn't here. And the Republicans aren't in charge of the House. The Democrats. Nancy Pelosi
Assistant
is in
Democratic
charge
Leader
of the
has
House.
the floor. The Assistant Democratic Leader.
I might say to my friend from Idaho, it is not unusual for us to move on a measure before the paper has come across the rotunda. We do it by consent. Yes, it happens here. And we were prepared to do it again. Having said that, let me return.
Parliamentary inquiry, please.
Reclaiming the floor.
The Assistant Democratic Leader has the floor.
And time remains on the Republican side. They can use it as they wish. Not at this moment. I want to finish my comment as I allowed the senator from South Dakota to finish his. I hope you'll show me that respect. Thank you. Measures that have been raised this morning are important measures, and for the most part, my colleagues are pushing on an open door. The Rubio-Cardin plan is one that I support. It's supported on a bipartisan basis. I think it's an excellent idea for dealing with the challenges of restaurants and small businesses. I support it. There's no issue in terms of whether that'll be included in the final package. I believe it will, and I certainly hope it will. The notion of cash payments, this notion of that was brought to us by the White House, I don't hear any objection whatsoever on the Democratic side of the aisle for the cash payments. The notion of extending unemployment insurance and providing additional benefits under unemployment insurance, I guess we're going to argue as to who came up with the idea first, but both sides agree on that basic idea. So these proposals brought before us are not in controversy, as I understand it, in the negotiations that are underway. The thing that I was concerned about, and Senator Schumer addressed, was it really focusing, and Senator Manchin raised the same issue, focusing on the threshold issue of the capacity of our healthcare system to deal with this public health crisis. When we hear the governor of New York this morning suggesting that the hospitals of that state have to increase their capacity by 50% and it still might not be enough, it's a suggestion to all of us that we need to start with healthcare and hospitals. It was our feeling that the bill which Senator McConnell tried to move yesterday was not adequate, didn't provide the necessary resources for that. I hope that when we return to this measure, and it's been said by the Senator Schumer and others that it could be today, and I pray that it will be, I think you will find additional resources for hospitals and health care. In my state, that is a critical element. Let me also talk about the fact that we are dealing with a bill of great importance and great magnitude. Reflect for a moment that the amount of money we are talking about in this bill is roughly equivalent to the entire domestic discretionary budget of the federal government in 1 year. And we are dealing with this bill, as we should, on an urgent basis. We should take care to make sure we do the best we can, but not wait for the perfect. Make sure that we have something that is good and responsive to the needs that we have. I also think that the measure yesterday that was pushed by Senator McConnell did not provide adequate resources to state and local governments. When I talked to my governor in Illinois, Governor Pritzker, they are expending money in ways they never dreamed of to deal with this public health crisis. They're also seeing more unemployment insurance benefits claimed than we ever have in our history. We need to help the state and local governments, and that was one of the objections we had to the bill yesterday. We didn't feel that it was adequate. When it comes to corporations and providing help to businesses large and small, count me in. I'm one of those Democrats who stood for the stimulus package that President Obama brought before us because I thought it was necessary. I still believe that we did the right thing in passing that stimulus package. Many on the other side of the aisle did not. Part of that package helped larger corporations, and so be it. I thought that was necessary, but we learned a bitter lesson. Many times, the benefits being given to those corporations and the tax breaks being given to them translated into stock buybacks where many took the money and ran. We don't want that to happen again. Arguing for transparency and accountability on the money that goes to any business, large or small, is not unreasonable and used to be bipartisan. We are arguing over that, debating over that, negotiating over that at this minute. Let me also say that I continue to be amazed at the references to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She really unnerves a lot of people on that side of the aisle. She is the Speaker of the House, you know, and the measure, whatever we do here, is headed over there for consideration. The fact that she would want to be party to that negotiation is not an outrageous idea. It happens to be consistent with the bicameral system of government that we have. The senator from Kentucky got up and talked about how she came into the meeting and ruined the whole meeting by asserting herself as Speaker of the House. It's reasonable for her to do that. In fact, the suggestion by Senator Schumer at the outset was that we have the four corners, the four leaders, Democrats and Republicans, and a representative of the White House for this negotiation. That approach was rejected by the senator from Kentucky. We'll do our own, he says. We'll get back to you when we have a Republican plan. It wasn't bipartisan from the start, and it should be all the way. It's the only way it will work. And let me say for a moment that if and when, and I pray that it'll be done under circumstances where we've reached an agreement, if and when we vote for cloture to motion to proceed, at that point, the senator from Kentucky can offer any amendment he wishes. I hope at that point we have an agreement, and we all agree to do it in a quick fashion. But this idea that it's going to be instantaneous as soon as we vote for the motion and cloture on the motion to proceed, it's not a fact, and it hasn't been for a long time. Let me just conclude by saying this, an observation on something related to our meeting here today and what is going on in the United States of America. 5 of our members did not vote yesterday on your side of the aisle. 1 has been diagnosed as having COVID-19, and the other 4 have self-quarantined because of concern about their own health. It is natural. It is naive for us to believe that that is the end of this challenge to our membership. I implore you to consider the bipartisan measure that Senator Portman and I have offered for remote voting. We should not be physically present on this floor at this moment. We know better. And our staff is subjected to whatever we bring on the floor in terms of viral load. Let's think about this in human terms. Too many of our colleagues and their families are falling prey to this disease. We should change the rules of the Senate to reflect humanity and reality. It's the 21st century. Voting in a remote fashion, as I've suggested with Senator Portman, is the best way, I think, to protect us and our families from further problems from the health viewpoint. Let me close with the final word in saying this. Senator Schumer came to the floor and didn't say arms crossed or stonewalling. He said he had to leave the floor to go back and negotiate. With whom? With Republican leaders from the White House and perhaps other places. That's the way it should be. We're going to get this done today. Take a deep breath. Everyone's emotional at this moment on both sides of the aisle, but we have a job to do, and we're going to get it done. I yield the floor.
For the information of the members, the majority has approximately 14 minutes, the minority 15 minutes. Senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been here 5 years. I came from another world where to get anything done, you had to compromise. The problem we have today, I can't find any partners to compromise with. This bill has been characterized as another bailout for large corporations. Really? That is the most amazing characterization I can hear today. When I look at this, what this bill is focused on is the American worker, who in the time we've been debating this morning here, thousands have had phone calls given to them today by their employer to say, we're sorry, but because of the liquidity situation we have, there's no demand for our products or services, we need you to go home. That's been going on now for weeks while we sit up here and talk and blame each other for things. The time for action is right now. This bill gives us an opportunity to bring over almost $2 trillion of liquidity to the American people who are in need. This is not about big business. As a matter of fact, I don't see any grants in here, Mr. President. What I see are liquidity opportunities so employers can keep their relationship with the employees. We've already heard the details today. Direct payments of $300 billion directly to individuals, $250 billion for 3 months of unemployment insurance, unprecedented. $350 billion going directly to small businesses. Why? So that they can keep their employees employed, even if they're furloughed, Mr. President. There are $500 billion being made available for loans through our banking community. This is federally guaranteed loans. These are not grants. These are not monies that are going to go to the boards and the executives and all of that. This is money that's going for the purpose of getting directly to payroll. There's $517 billion of tax deferrals on withholding taxes on the corporate side. That's a 1-year deferral. That is not a guarantee. It's not a grant. There are $250 billion of other monies, 180 of which is going to cities and municipalities and state. And I agree with the assistant leader of the Democratic Party that we might need to do more for our states and local communities. So let's get to it. If that's the biggest issue here, but that's not the biggest issue. There are so many of these other things that are being thrown at this bill because it is a big bill. It's unprecedented. But let me just say this. What we've done is trying to make this a situation where we can avoid a liquidity crisis causing an insolvency crisis. And that's the most damaging thing we can do to the American worker. At the end of the day, the American worker has something that they all have in common. They have an employer. That employer is made up of investors just like you and I who invest in those companies who employ these people. This is not a government employing 150 million people in our workforce. This is about getting the American economy a bridge, and that's all this is a bridge to weather this medical crisis that we have. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Senator from
Thanks, President. I appreciate the comments from the senator from Georgia. I There's plenty of negotiations going on. I don't know what he means when he says he doesn't have anybody to negotiate with. I just spent 2 hours with Secretary Mnuchin talking about provisions of this bill. We spent hours on Friday and Saturday talking within our committees. I applaud Senator Rubio, what he and Senator Cardin did. There's been bipartisanship, but not from the majority leader, and that's really fundamentally been the problem, the Republican leader. Let's back up 10 days. I stood on this floor, Senator Durbin was here, a bunch of us, when Senator McConnell on a Thursday night, we were this close to agreement with the House on the second package, the ones that had sick days in it, sick leave policy. We were that close. Senator McConnell decided he had to go back to Kentucky to go to a political event with the Justice of the Supreme Court, a political event with the Justice of the Supreme Court in Kentucky.
Yield.
I'm sorry, what?
Will the senator yield?
Of course.
When did the Senate receive that bill from the House?
That's not the point. The point is that...
Will the senator yield?
Certainly.
Will you answer my question? When did the House receive that bill?
I don't know the day, but I know it was a day or two later.
What about where has the House been for the last week?
I'm not yielding now, Senator Connell.
Where has the House been for the last week?
I know you always want to do Trump, the president's bidding, and always want to do is I have the floor and I will keep the floor. The fact is that we were in negotiations with Speaker Pelosi, I assume with Leader McCarthy. In the Senate, we were this close to legislation. Senator McConnell went home. Senator Cotton's not disputing the fact he went home for a political event with a justice of the Supreme Court, for gosh sakes. Went home Friday. We didn't vote Friday. We didn't vote Saturday. We didn't vote Sunday. We didn't vote Monday. We didn't vote Tuesday. We didn't vote until Wednesday. So we've tried to be bipartisan. Senator McConnell then dispatched all of us just a few days ago to do negotiations within our committees. I sat with...
Would the senator yield for a question?
Well, I'd like to sort of explain the
senator does not
details,
yield.
but if the time comes out of your time, I'd be glad to.
The senator yields.
My question will be short. Is it not true that the bill to which the senator refers was still being written over the weekend, and it would have been impossible for the United States Senate to vote on it before Monday?
No, the answer to that question is no, it would have been possible. We can always suspend the rules and move if it's in the national interest, but we didn't vote, you know this, Senator Alexander, we didn't vote until Wednesday. But let me back up. So this weekend, Senator Crapo and I and Banking Committee members were making progress on Friday and Saturday. Then Saturday night, Senator McConnell decided that he would take everything back and write a partisan bill. So don't tell us that this has been a bipartisan effort. Again, Senator Rubio and Senator Cardin had some bipartisan efforts. We attempted that. But the fact is, we need to learn from 10 years ago, the same people came to us and said, we need this bailout. They promised that it would help people stay in their homes. They promised that it would be money in the pockets of workers. The banks have done well. The executives have done well. But since then, wages have basically remained flat. The American people don't want another corporate bailout. They don't want a bailout for Wall Street. They don't want a bailout for the airlines. They want money. If we're going to do a relief package, the money needs to go in the pockets of workers. We know that in case hundreds of people, thousands of people in each of our states are faced every day with this situation. Do I go to work? I'm sick today. Do I go to work and possibly infect somebody else in the workplace? Or do I stay home and lose the pay that I need in order to pay my mortgage or in order to pay my rent? We need this plan is all about a corporate bailout. The money, $425 billion, that the Secretary of Treasury can decide as a slush fund on where to direct that money instead of money going to workers, to food banks, to unemployment insurance, to sick day policy, to all the things that we need to do to keep businesses going and people in their homes. We have a prohibition that so far Senator McConnell has objected to on foreclosures and evictions. You all know the statistics. 40% of Americans don't have $400 discretionary money in their pockets that they can use in an emergency to fix their car or whatever. If they go several weeks without pay, they will be evicted. They will be foreclosed on. We need Senator McConnell to actually agree to that. And when it comes to the $425 billion slush fund, we want to help
these businesses, especially small businesses. We want to help the airlines, but we need to make sure that this money passes through to employees. That means no corporate bailouts without investing in the dignity of work. It means if you're taking taxpayer money, no stock buybacks, no sending jobs overseas, no outsourcing your jobs to independent contractors, no golden parachutes for executives, no using taxpayer dollars to bust unions, no wage cuts for these employees, no health care or pension cuts. We put money into these businesses. This money is there not for the executives, it's there for the workers, and it's there for the community. It means actually helping people stay in their homes. If you love this country, you fight for the people who make it work. We have to show the people we serve that we've learned from Congress's mistake 10 years ago when the banks did very well, thank you, and Wall Street again will do very well, thank you, under the McConnell plan. We have to come together to put money in people's pockets. We need to help people stay in their homes. We need to invest in healthcare workers who are on the front lines. We need to mobilize American manufacturers. The partisan McConnell plan doesn't do this. The bipartisan work we're trying to do could do this. We know we can get through this together. Put this partisanship aside. Come together for the people whom we serve. I yield the floor.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I would defer to the gentleman from Tennessee.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank the South. I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The senator will state his inquiry.
Mr. President, the discussion we just heard was about when the Senate could have voted on House Bill 6201, which was the bill that came over from the House. When did that bill from the House of Representatives arrive in the United States Senate?
It came to the Senate on Tuesday, the 17th.
On Tuesday, the 17th. And my second question is, could the United States Senate have voted on that bill before it arrived from the House of Representatives?
It would take consent. The Senate has done it on several occasions. In one case, H.R. 3630, the Middle Class Tax Relief Job Creation Act. Another case, H.R. 2194, Comprehensive Iran Sanctions, Accountability, and Divestment Act. It would take consent.
Did anyone ask consent that it be voted on before Wednesday?
The chair does not have any record of a request for consent.
I thank the senator from South Dakota.
Senator from South Dakota.
North Dakota.
Oh, I said North. Sorry.
I want to talk about the bill that we want to vote on right now, and why it's so important that we pass it. And, you know, for my part, what I work on is support for our farmers and our ranchers. And that's exactly what we've put in this bill, is help and support for our farmers and ranchers, for rural America. And yet, my understanding is that Democrats are objecting to the help and support that we've put in this bill for our farmers and ranchers. Last week, the Department of Homeland Security recognized that agriculture, our supply of food, fiber, and feed, is one of our nation's critical industries. Our country's been blessed with an abundant, affordable, and safe food supply that we rarely stop to notice, but that we depend on every single day, and we certainly depend on at this time with this pandemic. Good news is that our farmers and ranchers, our ag sector, are out there working every day, carrying on this critical work of ensuring that we have the food on our grocery shelves throughout this pandemic. The bad news is that the farm economy, already facing a number of years of declining income, has taken a further nosedive on the account of the coronavirus. And so we have put forward assistance to make sure that we address that. Let me just give you one example, though, of the difficulty faced in farm country, in rural America. The cattle industry's lost between $7 and $9 billion over the last 2 months. And that's just one sector of our ag economy. Congress needs to act, and we need to act now to ensure that farmers, ranchers, and rural America, farmers, ranchers, and rural America receive the relief they desperately need. Why would Democrats object to that? Why would they object to that? We included two important provisions to ensure that rural America and our farm and ranch families receive assistance. First, we replenished the Commodity Credit Corporation, making sure that the CCC has the funding necessary to carry out the Farm Bill, including the Farm Safety Net, conservation programs, trade programs, as well as emergency and ad hoc programs like the Market Facilitation Program. Second, we increased CCC authority to ensure that we can meet the coronavirus impact on agriculture head on. That makes sense. That's in the bill. They're objecting to it. They're objecting. This is our food supply. This is our food chain. We also included an important provision that enables USDA to provide critical support to ranchers during this market downturn, to ranchers. However, the Senate Democrats are objecting to that provision. Congressional Democrat leadership has objected to helping our farmers and ranchers in this relief package. The bill also includes an additional $15.5 billion for the SNAP program, for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for food stamps, to provide nutrition assistance for those affected by this economic downturn. I urge my colleagues to get on board and support our farmers, our ranchers, and our food supply. Support rural America. Quit objecting to rural America. Quit objecting to our farmers and ranchers. We can't let that happen. We've talked about the importance of the bill. It's important for our entire country. And it is certainly important for our farmers and for our ranchers and for the food supply, the lowest cost, highest quality food supply that they provide every single American every single day. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
The majority has 5 minutes. The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know what the American people are thinking right now? They're thinking that the brain is an amazing organ. It starts working in a mother's womb, and it doesn't stop working until you get elected to Congress. You know what the American people are thinking right now, Mr. President? They're thinking that this country was founded by geniuses, but it's being run by a bunch of idiots. You know what the American people are thinking right now, Mr. President? They're thinking, why do the members of the United States Senate continue to double down on stupid? Now, this is not a Republican bill, Mr. Chairman. This is a bipartisan bill. We have spent hours and hours and hours negotiating these provisions with our Democratic friends. This is not a slush fund. This is a bill to help people and businesses in America. This bill is going to increase unemployment insurance. This bill is going to send $1,200 to every man and woman in America, taxpayers who make less than $75,000 a year, and $500 for each of their children. This bill is going to help every small business in this country. It's not a bailout. It provides up to $350 billion for small businesses for the next 8 weeks to keep going. And if they don't lay anybody off, the loans are forgivable. Now, we have some businesses in this country that are bigger than 500 employees. This bill has a provision to help them too, as well. In America I was raised in growing your business and becoming as large as possible was something we aspired to. This bill does not create a slush fund for the Treasury Secretary. It provides $75 billion to help some of our industries hardest hit in a collateralized loan, not a bailout, and then provides another $425 billion to the Federal Reserve under Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act, which the Federal Reserve will make available to all businesses, including those that don't qualify as a small business. And it's not a gift. We can negotiate warrants. We can negotiate stock options. We can take a piece of their company in stock. Mr. President, I don't understand it. I get politics. I've been around it my whole life. But there comes a time when we have to stop thinking about the next election and start thinking about the next generation. What are we going to leave to our children if we allow this economy to crash? And it is happening as we speak. I mean no ill will toward my Democratic friends. I like and respect every one of them. But let's pass this bill. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Is there objection?
There's objection.
Objection having been noted by the senator from Connecticut. Less than 10 minutes remaining. Consent is required. The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. You can't keep on saying it's a bipartisan bill when it clearly is not. If it was a bipartisan bill, you wouldn't have this level of angst from Democrats who were shut out of the process. Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. We don't think your bill works. We don't think the bill that has been drafted by the majority party is going to fix the problem. This is a policy disagreement, and I have an obligation as a representative of my state to stand up and say when I don't think a $2 trillion bill is going to fix the problem. It may make a lot of people rich, but it doesn't have the resources in it today to take care of the most vulnerable in this country, and it's not going to do the primary job at hand, which is to stop the virus. Remember, there's no amount of economic stimulus that we can pass, $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion, that will solve this problem if we don't get serious about the public health crisis that exists today. And when you shortchange states, when you don't provide enough money to help my state and my municipalities manage testing, move congregate populations apart from each other, try to manage the crisis, then you aren't serious about stopping the virus. And so, yes, one of the outstanding issues in this bill is that we think we need more funding for the states and municipalities that are on the front lines of fighting the virus. And yes, we don't think this bill will work at job number one, which is stopping the public health crisis, unless we provide ample funding. And yes, we are worried about the lack of conditionality on funding to big businesses, to Wall Street. Yes, we are worried about the fact that this is going to make rich people much richer, and at the same time not actually stopping the public health crisis. These are policy differences. And instead of coming down here and having show vote after show vote, we should be sitting together and trying to resolve differences that, frankly, I don't think are so large that they can't be solved within the next several hours. And so I just hope that we understand that we are down here very frustrated because we worry that we are about to vote on a bill that is not going to solve the problem. That is a policy disagreement, but a policy disagreement that can be resolved.
Much time's remaining on our side?
5.5 minutes.
Senator from Montana.
Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. President. During the past couple of weeks, I've been talking to Montanans about their needs as we deal with this coronavirus. Healthcare officials tell me that the folks on the front lines that they need more masks, more protective equipment, and quite frankly, this bill does not get that done. It helps, but it doesn't get it done. Small businesses and their employers are telling me that they need immediate access to relief. This bill doesn't do that because, quite frankly, We need no more on the front end on bridge loans. Tax credits are great, but you got to be in business to be able to take advantage of those. Mayors and local cities officials are worried about that they can't keep up with the mounting needs that their communities are facing. This bill fails them. Tribal leaders across Montana have made it clear to me and to other folks in this body that they are largely and unfortunately ignored in the bill before us. This bill is nearly $2 trillion. One of the things it does do, and I know there's folks on the floor right now that disagree, but the fact is massive corporations through that $500 billion slush fund that I might add has very little, if any, transparency or accountability, goes to those folks. Look, I think all of us agree that $2 trillion is a lot of money. It's all borrowed money, and if there's ever a time to borrow money, it's in time of economic times like this. But this needs to be targeted, temporary support to keep our economy going. As a senator from Connecticut said, the fact is that this bill, particularly this slush fund, is not a good use of taxpayer money. It would allow an unelected official with no accountability to the American people to dole out $500 billion while hiding the receipts for months, if not longer. And I know there's senators who say, well, they can get warrants for these loans. They must get warrants for these loans. As written, these companies could take advantage of billions of dollars in taxpayer money and continue to lay off some of those same taxpayers that are supporting through their taxes. Look, Montanans can do better, and we expect better. Working together, I'm going to tell you, we can get this done. There isn't a person in this body that hasn't filled a leadership position outside of their service in the United States Senate. You guys all know that you need to negotiate and you need to compromise. If that's done, and it's done in good faith, we'll have a bill before day is done. I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I could give you a very long list that describes everything we're doing here to help small business, the people of this country, our hospitals, personal protective equipment. Let me just say this. This bill was written by both Republicans and Democrats in good faith. It's time to get over our differences, put our country before ourselves. Let's come together and vote this bill out of the Senate now.
Remains on our side.
2 minutes, 20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me just say what I said at the outset. Strike a responsible distance and take a deep breath. We're going to pass this bill, not the one that Senator McConnell brought before us yesterday, but a version of that I think is a dramatic improvement. My prayer is that that bill is going to include even more money than the McConnell bill when it comes to dealing with the health care crisis we face and the challenge we face. More money for hospitals, more money for providers, more money for equipment, and we're going to have to come back again, I'm sorry to say, if this continues, to make sure that we put even greater investment in the men and women who will save our lives across this country. Secondly, we want to make certain that this McConnell bill is improved when it comes to accountability for the taxpayers' dollars given to the largest corporations in America. Some of us feel burned by what's happened with some of those corporations in the past when we trusted their leadership to build their companies and help their employees, and instead they built their own bank accounts at the expense of their employees. We don't want to return to those days. I'm sure the Republicans don't either. We want language in this bill that moves us in the direction of accountability and transparency when it comes to spending taxpayers' dollars by major corporations. And third, never overlook the need of state and local governments. They have been waiting, begging, pleading with the administration in the White House to give national leadership. And absent that, they've taken up the responsibility themselves. They're asking us to stand behind them as they make these difficult decisions state by state by state, because the White House refuses to make these same decisions. We need to provide them the resources to do that. State and local governments need that help, And I believe the McConnell bill could be improved by providing more resources in that regard. There are so many bipartisan things that we do agree on in this bill. Let's get these things right. And as Senator Murphy from Connecticut said, if we don't get it right in terms of dealing with the coronavirus, we can't put enough money on the table for economic recovery. Let's do it. I'm sorry that we're going to this roll call. It is not an indication of the progress that I believe has been made since yesterday in negotiating a bipartisan approach to improving the McConnell bill. I think that's underway at this moment, and I think we recognize that. Thank you.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 157, H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to repeal the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage, signed by 16 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to repeal the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage, shall be brought to a close upon reconsideration? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the order. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Bozeman, Cornyn, Cotton, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Kennedy, McSally, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Tillis. Senators voting in the negative: Brown, Durbin, Murphy, Stabenow, Tester, Udall. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. King, no. Ms. Markowski. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. No. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. No. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. No. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. No. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris. No. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. No. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. No. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. No. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. No. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye.
What do we vote?
Ms. Hassan, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Jones. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye.
Okay. Are we ready? On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 46. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative upon reconsideration, the motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to H.R. 748, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 157 H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to repeal the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Just for the information of all of our colleagues on both
Can we have
sides.
order, please? Senators will suspend their personal conversations, move them off the floor. The Majority Leader.
For the information of our colleagues on both sides, as a result of this procedural obstruction, let me explain where we are. By refusal to allow us to take this first step, which would have still given them plenty of time to negotiate, we have put the Senate in the following position. If any one of the 100 of us choose to object, we can't deal with this until Friday or Saturday at the earliest. If any one of the 100 of us objects to some of the procedural hurdles we have to overcome as a result of this mindless obstruction, absolutely mindless obstruction going on the other side, while the public is waiting for us to act, while people are losing their jobs, losing their income, and shutting down the economy, which we've had to do to deal with this public health crisis, they are fiddling around with Senate procedure that could, if one senator objected, take us all the way to the end of the week to solve this problem. I'm beginning to think our Democratic colleagues don't understand the procedure in the Senate. I'm not sure you understand the position your leaders put you in. He loses nothing, in terms of negotiating leverage by letting us get through these procedural hoops sooner rather than later. Sooner rather than later. The American people have had enough of this nonsense. They wonder where we are. They're looking to us to solve this problem. The Secretary of the Treasury keeps going into the Democratic leader's office. The list keeps getting longer and longer and longer. The bazaar is apparently open on the other side. Never let a crisis go to waste. One former president's chief of staff famously said. So look, I hope my colleagues will come out here and express themselves in the course of the afternoon. The American people would like to hear from us. They'd like to know what's going on here. So let's tell them. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.